When all the parties were the same, they were all espousing the same ideology of centrist fundamentalism, of down with us, up with everybody else, down with our borders, down with our traditions, down with our history, and up with everyone else, particularly if they happen to be Muslim and hate us. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is banned across the Arab world. It's banned in Egypt, where it started. It's banned in the Emirates. It's not banned in the West. We're making ourselves dumb. We've made ourselves stupid. And we're no longer standing up for ourselves. And we're in danger of losing any appreciation of the very values that made us great in the first place.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Jake Wallis Simons. Jake, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Great to have you on. I feel like there's so much we need to talk about in relation to the Israel question, what's happening with Jewish people in Europe and around the world, all those things that you've been writing about for a long time, and you've really been writing about particularly since the 7th of October pogrom. And you have a new book out, which is called Never Again, How the West Betrayed the Jews and Itself. So there is so much in that book I want to ask you about. But I guess I'll kick off by asking you whether you ever thought that you'd have to write a book called Never Again. Never Again, ? By the way, is the title of the book. Did you ever think, even as you were editing the Jewish Chronicle and keeping an eye on what was happening with Jews in Europe, did you ever think it would come to this, that you'd have to write a book called Never Again?
Well, that's a good question to start with. I remember the last time I was on this podcast, Brendan, was in 2023, when Israelophobia was just about to come out. And that came out, weirdly enough, on the 7th of September. So exactly 4 weeks to the day before the world changed forever. And October the 7th, I think, was a 9/11 moment for the world. There's a kind of before October the 7th world and an after October the 7th world. And that book, Israelophobia, was sort of mapping out the kind of the dry lanes through which the ensuing flood would cascade after October the 7th. But I think that even then I couldn't have predicted October the 7th, but what came after October the 7th, the October the 8th phenomenon, if you like, the phenomenon of people celebrating it and what that's led to, the dominance of Hamas propaganda, not just on social media, not just in the legacy media, but also in policy making across the West and on the streets, and with, on a micro level of synagogues being smeared with shit, literally, in the last few days. I mean, all of that is a rebuke to the idea of never again, to the vow of never again that the world made to the Jews in 1945. And I do feel, as I explore in the book, the way in which we've sought to implement that vow of never again has allowed, in a certain way, anti-Semitism to come back through the back door. Anti-Semitism and Israelophobia is nothing if not a shape-shifting, cunning beast. And it's shape-shifted to commandeer the very mechanisms by which we've sought to suppress it.
I remember our conversation about your excellent book, Israelophobia, in 2023. And I'm very grateful for that book, not least because I've used the term Israelophobia so many times over the past 2 years. Often when I think I won't get away with saying anti-Semitic, I fall back on Israelophobic. But just to explain what you mean by that, I mean, how would you look at the phenomenon of the past 2 years? I mean, we all have seen what's happened. We've seen there's been a spike in attacks on Jews. As you say, feces is currently being smeared on synagogues in London. And as far as I can tell, there is very little discussion about that, very little hand-wringing from the so-called anti-racist lobby about that. And that obviously just follows 2 years of attacks and the ripping down of hostage posters, the graffitiing of synagogues, bottles being thrown at young Jewish girls, Jewish kids at the Jewish free school being told that they can remove their school blazers to avoid the attention of anti-Semites. I mean, just extraordinary stuff that really does bring to mind the phrase "never again?" ? How would you describe, before we get into the details of the book, how would you describe this phenomenon? Would you call it Israelophobia, or would you call it anti-Semitism? Or in your mind, are they pretty much the same thing these days?
Well, I mean, as I argued in that book, Israelophobia is anti-Semitism. It's just the latest form of it. Again, anti-Semitism is a shape-shifting virus. It went from, being a religious hatred in the Middle Ages to a pseudo-science in the 20th century, and now to a kind of political virtue signaling type of bigotry. But I think that the point I'm really trying to make in my new book is that the West has betrayed the Jews and itself, as it says in the subtitle. Actually, although this is a terrible time for the Jews will be all right. The Jews will be all right. As the late Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs put it, the Jews have been fighting a losing battle for millennia and surviving. We might not have been winning, but we've been surviving. And we're going to survive this. We know who we are. We know we're secure in our peoplehood, relatively. We're secure in our understanding of what it means to have a homeland and what it means to hold democracy alongside a sense of pride in your identity. It's really the West that's the worry. It's the future of the West that is called into question by not just the toleration, not just the indulgence, but the propagation of anti-Semitism that we see throughout Western countries today. And so my book is not so much about the Jews, but more about the West. What this rise in anti-Semitism says about the state of the West, where it comes from, and what can be done about it. As Zev Jabotinsky said about the Jews, we came before them and will be here after them. It's the West that has its fate hanging in the balance right now. And in the book, I explore how this happened. And I think we can trace it back to the aftermath of the Holocaust, to that first vow of never again, when the lesson that the West took from the Holocaust, in general, in broad terms, was to see Nazism and fascism, to trace it back to roots in national pride, in patriotism, in a belief in borders, in a belief in the nation and in oneself, in one's history and so forth. And to try to tamp down those things in the name of toleration, in the name of well, to use a modern term, diversity. And this evolved into what Sir Roger Scruton described as a down with us mentality. And that, I think, sums it up really well. In my book, I give it the label centrist fundamentalism, which evolved particularly actually after the Cold War, when the end of history came and went, and the elite, the Davos men and the Cameroons and the centrist, when all the parties were the same, they were all espousing the same ideology of centrist fundamentalism, of down with us, up with everybody else, down with our borders, down with our traditions, down with our history, and up with everyone else, particularly if they happen to be Muslim and hate us. And that ideology, I think, is responsible for the rise in radicalism, because it created a vacuum. The fundamentalism part in the centrist fundamentalism, the centrist part is not a reasonable centrism. It's more a kind of leftist social democracy, an elite leftism, I suppose, a champagne socialism that dominated. But the fundamentalism comes from the way in which that elite began to enforce this ideology onto ordinary people by deriding them, mocking them, and treating them with contempt as soon as they strayed from the dogma. So as soon as anybody wanted to enforce our borders, they were racist. As soon as anybody wanted to have sovereignty back from the European Union, they were fascist. They were Nazis. You can see it's all an anxiety about the Second World War, and that sort of derision and condescension and cancelling that was imposed upon ordinary people with the ordinary instincts that we've had since the dawn of history to love our family, our village, our city, our nation. That thing of love, that bonding of love that keeps us together was derided by the centrist fundamentalists. And I think that the Jews became wrapped up in that, because the Jews, as they always have been, were a rebuke to the Christian West, a rebuke to the secular West that came out of the Christian West, just as the Jews were a rebuke to Christendom by being a living embodiment of the rejection of Christ and a living embodiment of the rejection of the concept of personal divinity and of the idea that you can keep your peoplehood even when you've been exiled and defeated. So too, in the centrist fundamentalist era, the Jews were a rebuke to the idea that peoplehood could be extinguished. And that was really what wound up the centrist fundamentalists more than anything else, and what winds them up particularly about Israel, which not only will stand up for its peoplehood, but will defend it in a world where we've lost any kind of appreciation for the morality of military action in times of necessity.
That's really well put, and reminds me that I wanted to say to listeners and viewers that if they want to know what's wrong with the West right now, they should read this book. I mean, this is a book about the Jewish experience and what's going on with the Israel question. But as you say, it's fundamentally about the West and what's gone wrong here and how we betrayed ourselves, and linked with that, how we betrayed the Jews. When you talk about how the seeds for this were sown when that slogan "Never Again" first came into existence, or what it actually meant, that is such a fascinating part of the book. And it reminds me that someone in Israel once said to me that, the lesson Europe drew from the Second World War is that nationhood is bad, and the lesson that the Jews drew from the Second World War is that nationhood is essential. And I think that is kind of the fork in the road that really comes about in 1945, 1946, and that explains a lot of where we're at the moment. So could you just touch a little bit on what you mean when you say "never again" was a problematic phrase from the very start? I mean, what were the elites saying "never again" to? We all presume they were saying "never again" to the genocide of a people, and that's something that the vast majority of human beings would agree with. But what else were they saying "never again" to when that slogan was institutionalized in the decades after the Second World War?
Yeah, I mean, let me be clear. I'm not saying it's a problematic idea.
Yeah.
I mean, never again, as Israelis, a common slogan in Israel at the moment is "never again is now."
Yeah.
Never again is now. So it's not that's the problem. It's correct. The problem is the way in which it was interpreted.
Yeah.
And it's understandable in many ways, because the Second World War was a global trauma, and certainly a Western trauma, that undermined the very core of our identity in many ways. You can see the art that was made after the Second World War, and indeed after the First World War. I think of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland after the First World War, and Dr. Faustus by Thomas Mann after the Second World War. Just looking at this total devastation of civilization, where the Germans, who were the peak of high culture and Western civilization, had allowed themselves to fall victim to the basest instincts that really should have been left behind many centuries ago. But yes, so never again. I mean, I think of Karl Popper's book, The Open Society, which really was a sort of template for that way of thinking. It was written in 1945, I believe. And it was a template for the idea of an open society, which we all want. And to some extent, we have an open, free society, tolerant society. But in his book, he talks about how the teaching of history is basically a teaching of jingoism, and how nationalism pervades our education system. You can see this sort of anxiety about Nazism in 1945 and where it's come from, and almost throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if that doesn't sound too trite. But there's also a line in there where he talks about toleration towards the intolerant. And he says something like, and I paraphrase, "If you tolerate the intolerant, then the tolerant will be done away, and tolerance with them." And that's really what we're saying today. Those warnings that even he built in to that manifesto back then have been forgotten and let go of as time has gone on, and as we've become more complacent, really, after the Cold War, like I said, with the end of history, and where our defense budgets have been shrunk, our welfare budgets have been vastly increased. We've become tolerant of people being workless. I mean, there's a record number of people not only not working, but not looking for work. Take that sort of complacency and go to Israel, where people are required to fight for their survival. And you'll find a lot of extraordinary things. You'll find that, for one thing, Israel is not just thriving as an economy, even during the war, by comparison to ours. Its economy is booming. Not only is its birth rate soaring, it's the only nation in the OECD which has a high birth rate that's over replacement. And there was a baby boom during the war. During the war. I think it's probably the only time in history where that's happened, a baby boom during the war rather than after the war. Israel's defense is, of course, thriving. It's in a more militarily dominant position now than it has been at any time since 1967. But most importantly of all, in a way, for our discussion, is that Israel is one of the happiest countries in the world. Before October the 7th, it was, I think, third or fourth happiest country in the world, behind just the Scandinavian countries. After October the 7th, it slid one or two places, and now, 2 years on, I think it's eighth in the world. By comparison, we're, I think, 24th in the world in Britain. The United States even further behind, and Italy is 41st, I think, something like that. So Israel is a happy country. It's an optimistic country. It's a young country. It's a powerful country. And all of that is because it hasn't forgotten who it is. If you go to Israel, as I think you have been, Brenda, or you're going shortly, you can feel it. It feels like a big family. People look out for each other. Kids are safe in the streets. The crime rate is very, very low. Rates of suicide, alcoholism, deaths of despair are very low, even in the poorest communities, in the Haredi communities. Those sorts of things, gambling, crime, almost unheard of. People, kids walk in the street, and if they get into trouble, a stranger will look after them. That's the feeling in Israel, and part of that is national service. People get together and defend their country because they feel their country is the same as their family. On October the 7th, people woke up. I heard Yoav Gallant, the defense minister who was in charge at the time of the war, saying this quite recently in an interview, that people would wake up at 6:30 like an ordinary day, have a coffee, and then within an hour had their pistol and were fighting for their lives to defend their families and the families around them. That's Israel, and that's not us anymore. That used to be us in the Second World War. It's not us anymore. And so I think that, in the words of Alison Pearson when she kindly endorsed her book, we all need to be a bit more Israel.
It's one thing that I've been thinking for quite some time, and your book helped to clarify these thoughts, is that the intensity of the fashionable hatred for Israel these days is directly proportionate to what we feel we have lost, or what we feel that we have turned our backs on here in the West. So, Israel, as you said, the Jews were previously seen as a rebuke against the virtues of Christendom, and in many ways they held on to the pre-Christ beliefs. Now, in many ways, Israel, the Jewish nation, is a rebuke against globalism and against that kind of post-borders ideology, the celebration of incapacity, the celebration of weakness, which unfortunately is very powerful in the West now. This idea that nationhood is outdated, flag waving is ridiculous, young people are weak, we can't expect them to work too hard, never mind fight for their nation. All that kind of collapse of virtue in the West is, Israel stands as a rebuke against all of that. And it says it is actually possible, and dare we say it, good, to hold on to those virtues that existed prior to the West's dismantling of them. So is that part of the phenomenon of Israelophobia, which is that Israel dares to do what we once did, but we now, for some reason, have abandoned as being foolish?
Yes, I think it absolutely is. My daughter, when she was a couple of years ago, we were in Israel actually just before October the 7th on holiday. And she was so taken with it. It was her first time there. She was about 14, I think, at the time. And I remember her saying, when we met some young people and some young soldiers and things, and she said to me, it feels like people have a reason to live here. That was the phrase that she came out with. And that captured so much. I think we've forgotten that here in the West. And I think that what we have this centrist fundamentalist belief that in order to avoid fascism, in order to have a pluralistic, tolerant society, we have to do away with peoplehood. And peoplehood and the nation are always going to be in tension to some extent. Ever since the Enlightenment and the advent of the separation between church and state, where we've had a secular state that can accommodate different religions, a national religion, but then minority religions as well, as equally British, as I know, as well as any other person who's grown up within Judaism. Jews in Britain are patriotic, and when I grew up in an Orthodox community in London, every Saturday, every Shabbat, we would recite a prayer for the Queen, as it was then, and for the royal family, which was engraved on the wall, which is the same in every synagogue in Britain. And I think that all we wanted was to be left alone, to be British, to strive and to thrive as best we could, and to feel secure within a Christian country. My grandfather fought for this country, my Jewish grandfather, at D-Day in the RAF. He was probably the most patriotic person I've ever met. And, at the time, I think if you'd have said to us back then that Christianity was going to be totally done away with and Britain would be a secular country that had lost its sense of identity, that would have made us feel less secure, not more secure. If you're a Jewish minority, you feel secure in a country that understands its own and respects its own identity and its own selfhood. And so peoplehood is really vital, I think, to be held in tension with democracy. You can't, and a secular democracy, you can't go too far to the one side or to the other. And I think that we have gone to the extreme of denying, tamping down, dismantling our peoplehood in the pursuit of noble goals of toleration and diversity, to use a much abused term. But it's led us to disaster. It's one of a couple of the other ideas that I play with in the book. One is the idea of the new radicalism, with this notion that because centrist fundamentalism did away with our natural instincts of love for country, love for family, love for peoplehood, and rendered them taboo, it left a vacancy for those instincts. And that vacancy was filled by people outside the mainstream, because the mainstream was policed by centrist fundamentalists. And who were those people? Well, there were three tribes of the new radicals. There's the progressive radicals, which we see running riot every Saturday in London, hating Israel as a proxy for hating ourselves and hating the West. And we see the Islamist radicals, the second tribe, again, deeply embedded in a very, very sinister way in our country via the Muslim Brotherhood. We can talk about that if you want to. And also we see the nationalist chauvinists, the far right, who aren't very much of a threat in Britain, but my God, they're a threat in America and across Europe as well. In America, you have actual Nazis, and so I think that this is a sort of what I think of as a funhouse mirror effect, that you create these distorted versions of previous virtues that take their place when those previous virtues have been rendered taboo.
Yeah, absolutely. I did want to press you a little bit on centrist fundamentalism, which you've talked about there, and it's a fantastic chapter in the book where you talk about it. And just to give listeners a sense of what you're talking about here, because when you say the word centrist, people will often think of centrist dads. They'll think of Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell and their surreally successful podcast, The Rest is Politics, which is listened to by centrist dads, as they're referred to. They think of led by donkeys, the kind of anti-Brexit crew. That's kind of what we think about. But you're talking about something much more entrenched, aren't you? Something that's not just a fashionable view amongst certain sections of, middle class society, but an entrenched turn against ourselves, the entrenchment of the idea that Britain is a problematic place with a problematic history and possibly a problematic future. By centrist fundamentalism, you're really talking about, I guess, the entrenchment over time of the down with us attitude.
Absolutely. And it's embedded in the elites, or it has been for many decades. But to be clear, I absolutely am talking about Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. I am totally talking about them in every way, because they are not, centrist dads are not a benign force.
Yeah.
They're a deeply damaging force to our society, in my opinion. And if I may, Brendan, mention a podcast, I'm launching a new podcast with Andrew Fox, the former parachute regiment officer, called The Brink, in which we look at ways to pull the West back from the brink. It's launching on the 18th of September. And really, it's a response to Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. In one of the adverts we produce that's going to be coming out, I say, I'm not Rory Stewart. He says, I'm not Alistair Campbell. That's the intentional gist. Because, let me tell you a story that's in the book, a sequential story focusing on Rory Stewart, the so-called conservative. He was on Sam Harris's podcast. I don't know if you heard this episode of Sam Harris's podcast, Making Sense, last year, I think it was. And Sam Harris, who, as we know, is an atheist and quite skeptical of Islam, particularly radical Islam, and was trying to press Rory Stewart on the connection between Islam and suicide bombing or terrorism. And Rory did everything that he could to deny any kind of connection between the two. He pointed to all sorts of other societies in which young people had become radicalized or had committed murder, from Jewish societies to Buddhist societies. And at one point, he even said, he compared people leaving London to go and fight for Islamic State to himself as a young man leaving Oxford and going to run a province in Iraq after the invasion. That sense of adventurism, he made a parallel between that. And yet when the only people who he was able to criticize was the Americans. He talked about the Americans' presence in Afghanistan. And he said, oh, you seem to waltz in and think that everyone should just do what you say, and you haven't got the patience for to stay in a culture for 20 or 30 years and really learn what it's all about. Well, the fact that they were in Afghanistan for about that period of time didn't seem to bother him. And then after that, Rory Stewart went on his own podcast and slagged off Sam Harris and said, there's this guy called Sam Harris who was pressing me for 20 minutes trying to draw a connection between Muslims and suicide bombers, and he called it Islamophobic, is what he said. After that, Sam Harris heard this, brought him back onto the podcast, and Rory gave some kind of qualified apology. Now, I tell you this little story because to me, this is the stuff that maps onto serious matters. For example, the thing that comes to mind is the Manchester Arena bombing. Now, I was a journalist. I used to work for the Daily Mail as a foreign reporter, but on this occasion, I happened to be covering a story down the road from Manchester at the time when the bomb went off. It was initially reported as a gas explosion. I went straight down there and was one of the first people on the scene after that Salman Abedi had blown up that bomb and killed 22 people. And I'll never forget it. It was I covered a lot of terror attacks in my time, and that one particularly stays with me. And in the inquest afterwards, there was a man called Kyle Lawler, young man who was a security guard who was employed at Manchester Arena at the time. And he, in his evidence, said that he had seen Salman Abedi coming in to the Manchester Arena with a big backpack on, and his suspicions had been aroused. But he didn't intervene because he worried that he was being Islamophobic. He doubted himself. He doubted his instincts. He doubted his own virtues. He thought he was inherently bad because he had been taught by the culture to believe that he is Islamophobic before he's anything else. Now, to me, I make the connection between Rory Stewart going on Sam Harris's podcast and doing his best to deny any link between suicide bombing and Muslims, and all the effort that he put in, the energy he put in to do that, even deriding Sam Harris as Islamophobic. I draw a link between that and the culture. I don't know whether Kyle Lawler was familiar with Rory Stewart. He probably wasn't. But these elites seep this view into society and create this web of taboo where you think, I'm not allowed to say that. I'm not allowed to think that. I'm bad. Which then I think led to that horrendous miss of the security guard failing to stop Salman Abedi, which led to that horrendous attack. So this is serious stuff. It's not just centrist dads are not blameless in this catastrophe. Another example, if I may, just very briefly, is the child sex gang scandal again, which I talk about in my book. The Labour Party definition of Islamophobia. It hasn't been written into law yet. We're working on it now to define it legally. But the definition was produced in a report back in 2019 that was adopted by the Labour Party. Now, that report was advised by a number of very controversial characters. Some would say extremists, Muslim organizations that the government has not engaged with for fears over extremism for decades. Even the chap who describes Jihadi John as a beautiful young man was involved in advising the government on this Islamophobia definition. Now, in that Islamophobia definition in 2019, which I'll remind you, was after the child sex scandal had come out in the Times, after that, so people were aware of that, they knew what was going on, consistently uses the word grooming gangs only in inverted commas, and specifically holds the word grooming gangs, or the idea of a grooming gang, as an example of Islamophobia, as a case study of Islamophobia. And there was one case study of a taxi driver, or a man who said that he thought a taxi driver was driving at him recklessly because he was a Muslim and they'd been radicalized by the grooming gangs, without any kind of evidence at all. And that report, the foreword to it, was written by Wes Streeting and Anna Soubry, two centrist fundamentalist titans of their age. Now, forward wind to today, and the whole thing has come out largely as a result of Elon Musk's intervention. And Wes Streeting is able to say that it was political correctness gone mad or something, whatever quote he had. He didn't take any personal responsibility. But in their foreword to it, they explicitly said, and I paraphrase, that they hope that this definition will be percolated through all the institutions of government and local institutions and will begin to inform how people think towards Islam. There's a direct line between centrist fundamentalism and the child sex, the tolerance, the woeful tolerance and complicity, actually, official complicity in the child sex gangs. And so we see it time and time again that what seems like a harmless, foppish elite culture actually is to blame for the slow collapse of our society, not to mention Israelophobia.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point. And I remember that incident from the Manchester Arena bombing when the security guard was worried about being thought of as Islamophobic. So he left alone this young man who was walking around with a backpack he could barely carry, waiting around outside a venue which was full of young girls listening to Ariana Grande. I mean, that is a very suspicious situation, and yet people feel they can't act because they're worried about being accused of being anti-Muslim or racist. I mean, it was a perfect example of how lethal this discussion of Islamophobia can become. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that people are dying because we are so scared of being thought of as Islamophobic. And, we know for a fact that in relation to the rape gangs, young white working class girls were raped because police forces and others were worried about the issue of Islamophobia. So, how many people can be sacrificed on the altar of this censorious creed before we start to think seriously about the impact of centrist fundamentalism?
That's right. And I would just add to that briefly, but that, Israel hasn't got the luxury of ignoring that stuff anymore. It hasn't got the luxury of worrying about Islamophobia with a number of Muslim radicals trying to kill its children, and I think that at the moment, there's a drive in the West to force Israel to take on our hypocrisy of worrying about Islamophobia first before we even thought, and forcing Israel to commit suicide. That's what we want. We want Israel to down its arms and commit suicide so that we can feel better about our own hypocrisy.
Yeah, commit suicide like we've done. That's basically what we're saying to Israel at the moment.
We're doing it slowly, you do it quickly.
Yeah. So in relation to the denialism about radical Islam and the problems that it causes, I mean, just brazen denialism. People will go into such contortionist positions to try to avoid saying there's an issue here, when we all know that around 100 people in Britain have been killed by radical Islamists over the past 20 years. Far more have been killed in Europe. I mean, this is a serious problem in our societies. And you talked about the security guard prior to the Manchester Arena bombing not saying anything. But then, of course, there was the culture after the Manchester Arena bombing. Don't look back in anger. Don't talk about it. Forget about it. There's a culture of amnesia often around these attacks where we're actively discouraged from talking about them or focusing on them. What do you think drives that denialism in relation to radical Islam? And of course, we also see that denialism in the Israel discussion. People are unwilling to confront the fact that Israel is surrounded by radical Islamists, by armies of anti-Semites who are devoted to its destruction. We say that's exaggerated. We say it's not a problem. There is so much denialism about this issue. Do you think that's part of the culture of self-loathing, or is it driven by fear that, we might antagonize these radical extremists and they might get even worse? What drives that kind of Rory Stewart style reluctance to have an honest discussion about this problem?
That's a big question. I think I would answer it briefly in two points. Both are in the book. The first is the psychology of it. I talk about some quite new research, actually. A huge number of people over a huge number of countries around the world, a global study, which found that people who've grown up in autocracies, not in a democratic environment, have different psychologies, predominantly different psychologies in a large sample by comparison to people in the democracies. People in the autocracies have what they call a dark triad of three traits. One is Machiavellianism, one is narcissism, and one is a sort of anti-Kant, so seeing people as instruments rather than people in their own right who deserve their own humanity. And in the democracies, people have a light triad of the opposite, of humaneness, of empathy, and of seeing people as deserving respect, regardless of what they can do for you. And those two things, when they collide, we see this in the Hamas manipulation of the West. When you have people who have a preponderance of dark triad traits, particularly those who become part of the institution of repression in autocracies, colliding with basically gullible light triad Westerners, the manipulation is easy. And so there's a lot of that going on. But also, I think we need to talk about Islam, as it were. I've got a big section in my book entitled The Nazis of Islam. And it traces the history from the beginning between Muslims and Jews up to the present day, reflecting that on Muslims and the West. And it's my contention, looking at the history, that there's nothing inherently anti-Semitic about Islam. There isn't. Of course, there are anti-Semitic verses in the Quran. They're actually fewer in number than one would think. There's more in the Hadith. But, every scriptural tradition has certain scriptures that it downplays and certain ones that it focuses on. And for millennia, for about 1,000 years, those anti-Semitic tropes weren't really focused on in Islam. Jews lived in Islamic societies, yes, as dhimmis, as second-class citizens. This is before democracy. So look, let's set our standards in the right place. But often they thrived and they had positions of some influence and power in Islamic. I mean, look, it's 1,400 years of history, so you can't generalize. But there were absolutely massacres of Jews. But I think on the whole, there was nothing as bad as there was in the Christian West, where we were motivated religiously to persecute the Jews to a much deeper extent. More recently, there was nothing as good in Muslim societies as the West in its best expressions. But certainly, anti-Semitism that we see in Muslim societies today, it really came from the Christian West, exacerbating existing anti-Semitism in Muslim societies and forming it in its own image. And this particularly became there was a watershed moment really after the Second World War, when the Muslim world, who had become so humiliated by the dominance of the Christian West, began to align itself with Hitler as a fight back against Christendom, and to try to find its own pride in the model of Hitler's fascism. And at that point, there was this great synthesis of Hitlerism and Islamic extremism, which was expressed really through the Muslim Brotherhood, through, first of all, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then Sayyid Qutb, who is a kind of, I call him Daddy Jihadi in my book. He is the intellectual from which all jihadi strains come. Hamas are explicitly an outcrop of the Muslim Brotherhood. ISIS is, Al-Qaeda is, even the Islamic revolutionary regime has links to the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's that Muslim Brotherhood that is seeking the destruction of the kuffar, the destruction of the infidel, the destruction of the West, and certainly, of course, the destruction of the Jews. And the Muslim Brotherhood, it has a very long-term plan. Yes, they're jihadis. Yes, they want violence, but they see it as a last resort. They first of all want generational change. They want to create Muslim communities, radical Muslim communities that don't integrate, that increase their numbers, that use democratic levers to gain power over countries, and then enforce Sharia when they've got the numbers and the power. And they will resort to violence if they have to, but they'd rather not. They'd rather play a generational game. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is banned across the Arab world. It's banned in Egypt, where it started. It's banned in the Emirates. It's banned in Bahrain. It's banned in many other Arab countries. It's not banned in the West. And its center of gravity has moved, therefore, from the Arab world to the West, to Britain, to Canada, to the United States, and to elsewhere. They have been here for a long, long time, for decades. And, in 2015, there was a government report by two distinguished security veterans, civil servants, Charles Farr and Sir John Jenkins, which identified the Muslim Brotherhood in our country as a national security risk. What does it do? The Muslim Brotherhood, it holds Muslim communities in its clutches. It dominates mosques, forcing them to be radical. It has a big outreach program from community centers to sports programs for kids, all sorts of other things. And it intimidates people from speaking out in a moderate way, from assimilating, from becoming British. It also has an operation, a political operation trying to inveigle its way into our parliament. It has a law operation trying to sue anybody who criticizes it in the press and so forth. And this is a cynical generational attempt to turn Britain into what it wants, into a Sharia country. It was laid bare in the 2015 report. But after that 2015 report named it as a national security risk, what did successive governments do? Excuse me for saying so, but the square root of fuck all. What is the square root of fuck all? Just fuck all. Nothing has been done. Nothing has been done. As a result, the Muslim Brotherhood is dominating Muslim communities in Britain. So we ask about assimilation. We ask about radicalism. Well, try banning the Muslim Brotherhood. That's what I advise in my book. That's what the Emiratis are begging us to do. And I was very gratified to see that at the Reform Conference in Birmingham, it's what Nigel Farage vowed to do. Nigel Farage, who, by the way, has endorsed my book, along with Kenny Basingstoke, along with Boris, weirdly enough, along with Michael Gove, along with lots of other people. But Nigel has endorsed the book and has finally put his policy where his mouth is and vowed to ban the Muslim Brotherhood. We need to do that immediately to release Muslim populations from their clutches, allow them to assimilate, and make our country secure again.
You know, it's the section in your book on the historic relationship between Muslims and Jews and how it's changed over time is really eye-opening. I highly recommend people read that, and of course the rest of the book too. And I think you're right. Farage has really forced this question now. It probably inspired by the arguments you've made that, the question is, what do we do about the Muslim Brotherhood? It always strikes me as extraordinary that it's considered the progressive position or the left-wing position just to leave British Muslims at the mercy of these radical movements, as if they are their true representatives. That strikes me as a pretty anti-Muslim thing to do, and it grates against the assimilation that would benefit British society and British Muslim communities, because they would be more of a part of society rather than being apart from society. I want to just two more quick questions for you, Jake. I wanted to ask you about authoritarianism. You write in the book about the new authoritarianism, and you talk about the various authoritarian things that have happened in the UK over the past few years. You even touch on the trans question and the fact that it's become difficult for women to speak honestly about what a woman is. I wanted to ask you if you could just say a little bit about the role that you think this new authoritarianism plays in entrenching precisely this culture you've just been talking about, this kind of betrayal of the West and subsequently the betrayal of the Jews. What role does the new authoritarianism play? Is it a matter of increasingly it restricts us from speaking honestly about the problems we face, and therefore it exacerbates those problems? What role does censorship authoritarianism play here?
Well, I think we need to see where it comes from. And where it comes from is somewhere very deep in the betrayal of our legacy, Enlightenment legacy of what the West is. If you wind back to Adam Smith, there's a lovely quote which I can't remember verbatim, unfortunately, so I can't give to you word for word. But Adam Smith in 1755 gave a lecture in which he talked about what's needed for a healthy society. And basically it's limited taxes, law and order, and freedom for people to find their own happiness in their own way, to make their own free associations, their own groups, their own organizations, and so forth. And really that's what government should be if it is to have any legitimacy. It needs to be an extension of the family, the village, the city, and the nation. When you begin to have a larger group of people in modern times, you need to have government to defend us, to provide for our interests, to look after the weak and the sick, and so on and so forth. But it's got to be an extension of us, an extension of our sense of ourselves, an extension of our family. That's what government has to be if it is to have legitimacy. And the problem is that what we've got now, it's been, as Hemingway put it, to rip off Hemingway, gradually and then suddenly. It's been happening over a long time. The gradually bit and then the suddenly under this Labour government. That contract, that trust has been undermined, not just with mass immigration, but we see it today that That the default attitude of the government is to see our freedoms not as natural to us, but as granted to us by the government based on its ideology and its assessment of what we need, what we deserve. The same with our money. Our money isn't naturally ours. It's granted to us by the government after it's apportioned it according to this principle of fairness. And so freedom becomes something that is granted. Wealth becomes something that is granted. Theft is called fairness, and repression is given the sheen of some kind of human rights. And that's where authoritarianism comes from. And it's wielded more and more because people don't like that. People don't want that. Nobody consented for the mass immigration that we have seen over the past 50 years, or 40, 50 years. Nobody consented to be told that we couldn't fly our flag. Nobody consented to have our children funneled through schools that teach them to be ashamed of themselves and teach them to have a totally naive appreciation for anybody who isn't us, regardless of how repellent they are. Nobody asked for our children to be brainwashed by this centrist, fundamentalist, new radical ideology. And the only way that the government can stop us from rising up against it is by the increasing spread of authoritarianism. And that's why we see 30 arrests a day for social media infringements, let alone non-crime hate incidents, which are a whole number of other door knocks daily on people's doors up and down the country to enforce the ideology of centrist fundamentalism with the police. It's outrageous. I remember went to a parents' evening at my kids' school a couple of years ago. I actually mentioned this in the book as well. And I saw, I was sitting in this room speaking to the teacher. I saw a display about the Holocaust on the wall. Next to it was a display about Black Lives Matter with some really quite radical quotes from radical anti-Western, the Black Lives, I go into Black Lives Matter as well in my book. They're all communists. They're all socialists. It's not the fact that they're black. It's the fact that they're radicals. They're using race as a vehicle for radicalism. And then next to it was a display about J.K. Rowling, painting her as the demon and trans activists as the heroes. And I wrote to the headmistress, and she, to her credit, had all those posters taken down and blamed radical young teachers on the staff. But that's the problem. We didn't consent for this. And in the end, the only way it can be enforced is by authoritarianism.
Yeah, it's becoming so clear over the past year or so that the policing of so-called hate speech is really the enforcement of ideology, or the control of what we're allowed to think about the way society is going. And yeah, you spell that out very well. Okay, Jake, my last question for you is about Israel. And people will often say, not many people, but some people will say that Israel's not just fighting for itself, it's fighting for the West. And I think what they mean is not only that Israel is fighting against groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis who hate the West as much as they hate Israel. So it's defending us from these, very violent, hateful, anti-Western groups. I think they also mean that in doing this, Israel is standing up for those virtues that we used to consider quite important, the virtues of courage, of national integrity, of peoplehood, as you describe it. It's standing up for those virtues as well. What's your take on that argument? Is that burdening Israel with too much, or how important is it, in your view, that Israel wins the current wars that it's fighting?
Well, it probably is burdening Israel, but Israel is burdened. Israel didn't ask for this war. It didn't ask for the rampant Israelophobia that swims around the world in a tsunami at the moment, or indeed since its very foundation, with ups and downs, but pretty much since then. But Israel has no choice but to take on that role by virtue of circumstance. And I would say it's related to a point that Benjamin Netanyahu made on a podcast just the other day. If you go to any Hamas fighter, any Hezbollah fighter, any Iranian Revolutionary Guard member, anybody who threatens Israel, and ask them, so what do you think of Britain? What do you think of the United States? What do you think of democracy? What do you think of the West? I can tell you what their answer will be. Actually, there could be two things. Either they'll say, we want to kill you all, which would be the honest answer, or they will say, they're our very good friends, which is even worse, because they're saying that because they're using you. They're using you. And This is the fight that Israel is fighting, and it's the fight that we are increasingly lining up on the wrong side of. When Keir Starmer said that Britain was poised to unilaterally recognize a state of Palestine, and he did so without any demands on Hamas at all. He didn't demand that Hamas would free the hostages. He didn't demand that Hamas would disarm. He didn't demand that Hamas would surrender. All he demanded was that Israeli troops would withdraw. And he said, if they don't withdraw and cease the campaign, then he will recognize a Palestinian state, incentivizing Hamas to keep the conflict going and to keep the hostages underground. That agenda could have been written for him by Hamas. And lo and behold, after he made that speech, Hamas officially congratulated him. This is the betrayal. This is the betrayal, of course, of Israel and of course of the Jews, but also of ourselves. Go to any one of those protesters on a Saturday, those 900 protesters who were arrested on Saturday for standing up for Palestine action, and ask them, what do you think of Britain? What do you think of America? What do you think of the West and democracy? And they'll have the same answers as Hamas have. Maybe not the bloodshed, but they wouldn't be too upset to see some deaths on the right, on the wrong side, or on the right side of the fence as they see it. This is what we are facing, and it's this somnambulance that pervades our culture after decades of centrist fundamentalism, complacency, just our sort of privileging of being nice over having any kind of self-preservation or common sense. We're making ourselves dumb. We've made ourselves stupid, and we're no longer standing up for ourselves. And we're in danger of losing any appreciation of the very values that made us great in the first place. So the West has given the world the biggest amount of human flourishing of any civilization in human history. We should be proud of that. We should want to preserve that and share it freely with people who don't seek to undermine us. That should be our approach, not this self-undoing, pathetic, slow suicide. And Israel is standing, again, because of all those reasons, standing on the front line of this. And we need to begin to realize that we need to get behind Israel rather than stand in enemy territory, waiting for them to slit our throats last.
Jake, thank you very much.
Thank you.